That one's a Tibetan Lobsang Dorje.
Good morning. So last night we looked at the transition from the trainings that are shared with the practitioner of initial capacity into the trainings of that are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity. So the primary trainings of a practitioner that are shared with the practitioner of initial capacity are the 6, reflecting on the impermanence of this precious human rebirth, reflecting on the intense sufferings of the lower realms. Those 2 reflections lead to the 3rd, the abandonment of the concerns of this life, and rather a concern about one's future lives. That leads to one turning to the 4th training of protecting refuge. And with that as a foundation, one is open and receptive to the teachings on cause and effect. And that cause and effect has the components of both accumulating virtue and turning away from non-virtue and purification. So these then are the 6 primary trainings of a being that are shared with the practitioner of initial capacity. Then, as we saw last night, that one should not be content with that. One should not see the development of a focus on attaining an excellent rebirth in our very next life as sufficient, but rather recognize that even when one attains an excellent rebirth and does not fall to the lower realms, one's position remains precarious in that in every life, as long as one is in samsara, there is the possibility that when death comes, one will fall to the lower realms. Moreover, even though one is in the higher realms, which are far more pleasurable than of course, the suffering realms, one still suffers. One is not at all free from suffering, as we know. Therefore, this recognition then turns us towards the trainings which are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity. And as we also saw last night, the trainings that are shared with the practitioners of both initial and intermediate capacity, these are the foundational trainings through which one develops a focused mind and a strength of mind, which is required to eventually become a practitioner of greatest capacity. So this is what we looked at when we move in the transition from the trainings shared with the practitioner of initial capacity to the training shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity. We were also briefly introduced last night to the primary training of a practitioner of intermediate capacity. So if we're looking at the text on page 153, let me see. So here we go. So there was one sentence yesterday where it was, here we go. So even though you attain the state of a God or human being in this manner, so in other words, through the trainings we've already looked at, those that are shared with the practitioner of initial capacity, you do not pass beyond compositional suffering. So this compositional suffering, or the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, this coming to recognize what this is a primary objective of a practitioner of intermediate capacity. And the text continued. Therefore, it is a mistake to consider that state to be naturally happy. So being born in the high realms and the happiness experienced there, to consider that this is a happiness worthy of striving for is a mistake. It's a mistaken conception. Since in actuality it is devoid of happiness. So this is a further primary training of a practitioner of intermediate capacity, to recognize that the happiness that draws us, even the happiness of a good rebirth, the happiness that draws us is not in actuality happiness. Why? Because it will never satisfy us. It's not in its nature something that leads to lasting happiness. And concluded. And in the end, it is bad because you'll fall to low rebirths again. No, sorry, again, I didn't read that. So just up to devoid of happiness. So this is the second key point that one focuses on in the trainings of being of intermediate capacity, that of coming to recognize that one is, wherever one is born, whatever one's situation, one is subjective to all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, and the happiness that one can experience in cyclic existence. None of it is in its nature happiness. It is not in actuality happiness, because it will pass. It will never satisfy us. To understand these two key focuses of the practitioner of intermediate capacity takes quite some reflection based on knowledge. So we need to come to recognize that our aggregates, so for example our body, has come about in dependence on karma, and that karma that has led to this ripening result of this body came together with the afflictions. So the afflictions leads to the accumulation of karmic imprints, which ripen in our various experiences, such as this body. So because the karma that has led to, in this illustration, our body, was accumulated under the influence of the afflictions, this karma is contaminated. It is not pure karma, it's contaminated karma. Then the result that follows has this fundamental flaw in it. And therefore, the situation we find ourselves in is unstable. So again, staying with the body, even as you'll all know from your life experience, when you're sitting perhaps here right now in excellent health, feeling strong and vibrant, the reality is, on meeting the slightest of conditions, it can all fall apart. Illness can follow, great pain can follow, and so forth. And this is certainly the case with the body. It's the case in general in our life. That even when things are going well, we have the hope, we have the expectation that it will continue. But it does not. It never can, because the very nature of of our aggregates in general, of this body in particular, is that it is subject to suffering, because it's come about from the ripening of contaminated karma. And part of the recognition here is that we have no free will. We are not in control, despite believing we are. For example, no one wills illness or pain or unhappiness, but yet it arises. We all do our very best to be freed of problems and difficulties, but yet we keep encountering them. So there's a lot here to understand, so as to cultivate the actual there's a lot here to understand which comes about through cultivating the trainings which are shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity. A key part of the reflection one goes through here is to come to finally recognize what actually is happiness and what is deceptive happiness. Because thus far, what we have experienced as happiness, striven for and achieved, and experienced as happiness, in reality, or in actuality, is not happiness, because it does not last. So again, staying with the illustration of one's body, we can talk about the body, the feelings of happiness or pleasure in relation to the body as either being physical happiness or the feeling of happiness arising from the body. And really, what we're calling happiness in terms of our body, the feelings relating to our body, is that our body, the elements of our body are in balance. That is all. So we feel okay. And then we say, yeah, I feel fine. I'm feeling good today. The energy is excellent, or whatever it may be. When really what we are calling happiness is just being in a state of balance. And when we recognize that what we call happiness is nothing more than a state of balance, we recognize from the usage of the word balance that a balance can so easily be lost, can so easily go out of balance. It does not take much of a cause or condition to come about for one's balance to be lost. The balance of the elements of the body, it doesn't take much for them to be lost. And then suffering arises. Pain arises. It can be slight, can be intense, it can be short-lived, it can be lasting. And here, as an illustration to reflect on, even when someone is sitting, feeling strong and healthy, in reality, or in actuality, they cannot say with any conviction that they are in excellent health. The closest they can say is, as far as I know, everything is fine. Because there are all too many instances of someone being or believing themselves to be in excellent health, but within, the elements are not in harmony. There's a cancer perhaps is developing, and they go for a routine checkup, go to routine blood tests, and then they suddenly find out things are very wrong, and that they are actually deeply ill. They just haven't yet experienced the feeling of suffering. So this then is an illustration of this mistaken understanding. So in our third from bottom line, therefore it is a mistake to consider that state to be naturally happy. This is an illustration of that. Sitting thinking everything's great, when actually one inside is diseased, but is still undiagnosed. And this is an illustration of how what we call happiness really is not, because in actuality it is devoid of happiness, because it does not last. So what we will be led through to challenge within us is this mistaken conception that what we experience as happiness is real happiness. So the emphasis here is on the word real happiness, or genuine happiness. This is the mistaken conception. So, for example, when the body is good, perhaps we still in the flush of youth, and the body is looking good, and we're feeling good inside. We also have this perception that this state will last. But the reality is, from the moment of conception, this body has been going through a process of aging. So we'd normally say change, but it is also a process of aging. This naturally happens. And with the process of aging comes the process of decline. And when we're younger, this is all too often quite hidden for us. But this is happening nevertheless. The body, as one ages, declines ever more. The signs become apparent, both on what's a visual level, as well as what one is feeling, the changes one is feeling inside. And this decline eventually ends in death. And this is the final part of the sentence. And in the end, it is bad because you will certainly fall into low. In the end, it is bad because, maybe just to there, because death will come. Because death will come. And this body that we spent an entire life caring for, so keeping it warm, keeping it dry, making sure it looks good, smells good, and healthy as best we can, in the end, it withers, and it no longer can support life. And it ends up just being placed in a hole in the ground or burnt. And that's all it is good for in the end. Yet, as we live our life, and we're happy with how we're looking, we're happy with how we're feeling, we're completely blind to the reality of our situation. And then when death eventually comes, there remains the position that we may well fall into the lower realms, because we are not yet free to determine our own rebirth, our own place of rebirth. The trainings of a practitioner of intermediate capacity are built on the indispensable foundation of the trainings that are shared with a practitioner of initial capacity. So in the trainings of a practitioner of initial capacity, we looked at the impermanence of this precious human rebirth. So first we recognize just what incredible opportunity we have, but then we recognized that it is finite. And we came to see that this body eventually will not be able to support life. Death is certain. Now, this is being built on, and we come to recognize now in the chapter as it unfolds that this body is naturally subject to suffering, what's sometimes translated as in the nature of suffering. The body is naturally subject to suffering, which means it can never lead to lasting happiness. So this is a far deeper understanding. Likewise, in the trainings of a practitioner of initial capacity, when we recognize that after this, when death comes, there is the real possibility that one may fall to the lower realms. And that is important because when you recognize what may happen, you then seek something better, which is something similar to what we have now, another precious human rebirth. Here, we come to recognize that's the foundational meditation, and that gets built on, that whilst it's indispensable we need to keep achieving excellent rebirths, actually, we will, as long as we stay bound in samsara, we are subject to suffering. We are not yet freed from suffering. We may, for one lifetime, or for this lifetime now, not in this lifetime, we may be liberated from rebirth in the lower realms. That possibility, though, of falling there remains. And even in this lifetime, or a lifetime in a pleasurable rebirth, one suffers. One is not yet free. So here we see in the trainings of a being of intermediate capacity, one's scope is being raised. One is recognizing that not just getting one more good rebirth is sufficient. One actually needs to gain freedom because one is still subject to all pervasive suffering of conditionality or compositional suffering. And until one gains freedom from that, one will suffer. So from this, hopefully it's clear how there is a progression in the trainings that the Buddha has laid out, how one builds a foundation and then takes it deeper. And what's important in this is one is pointed out, what is pointed out to one, what we need to recognize for ourselves is our actual situation. And in the instance of these trainings, that we are subject to all pervasive suffering of conditionality, which means this body, again as the illustration, this body is naturally subject to suffering. That as long as one has a body that has come about from contaminated karma, it is subject to suffering. And this has to be recognized in a way that is not just intellectually understood, but leads to a transformation in terms of where we put our time and our energy. We need to have a transformation in terms of, I have to achieve something better than this. So it's just like if in one's home, one is struggling with a particular task, it takes up a lot of time and it's a bit of a pain. And then a friend says, oh, why are you still doing that? Now you can just buy this thing and it's a whole lot, the problem solved. It gets done much more easily. Oh, you recognize now that the problem can be solved and you'll seek out that solution. So too here, we have to be guided to see that what we've taken for granted as the only possibility, this ordinary samsaric existence, is not. It is continuously subject to suffering. There's nothing worth striving for, but there is something far better, liberation. So yeah, it's imperative that one comes to recognize that our aggregates, our body and mind, are flawed. That what we take for granted and think that this is as good as it can perhaps get, as good as it can perhaps get, is not at all the case. And we come to recognize this through understanding clearly the position we are in. So we all know suffering, the suffering of physical and mental pain, and we do our very best to avoid that. But that understanding of the suffering of physical and mental pain and the resulting wish to avoid it, we need to take to the deepest level of suffering, that of all pervasive suffering of conditionality. We need to come to recognize that we are subject to that, and thereby give rise to a determination to be freed of it, just like we recognize physical and mental pain as being unwanted, and we do what we can to be freed of it. Likewise, we should come to recognize what all-pervasive suffering is and strive to be freed of that. Likewise, for example, if one had some kind of strange condition where one was unable to experience thirst, one would have no idea when one needs to drink. One first has to actually recognize or have this sensation of thirst so as to seek out something to drink. So we need to know what the problem is so as to look for a solution. And this is why in Varanasi, in his very first turning of the wheel of Dharma, the Buddha taught that suffering needs to be known. And when he used the word suffering, of the various types of suffering, he was referring specifically to the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality. This is what needs to be known, understood, recognized. Because it's only through recognizing that we give rise to a determined attitude to be freed from it. So in this way, it's imperative one comes to understand the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, because it's through knowing this that one will give rise to a wish for liberation from such suffering. So now turning to the text. So at the bottom of page 153, training the mind in the stages of the path shared in common with persons of intermediate capacity has 4 points. So the first point, which is in this chapter, the actual training in the attitude. So this is training in the attitude of a practitioner that is shared with a practitioner of intermediate capacity. And then the measure of its development, this will come in the chapter thereafter, eliminating misconceptions and determining the nature of the path leading to liberation. So of those first outlines, our chapter deals with the first of the 4. So turning to the top of page 154, the actual training in the attitude. So what does attitude mean? It means training to develop the attitude or the wish for liberation from suffering. So this has 2 points: identifying the mind striving for liberation. So striving is this determined attitude to achieve liberation. And then the second point, so the methods for generating it. So the mind striving for liberation is the motivation of a practitioner of intermediate capacity. So this motivation then needs to be cultivated. Then one engages in the various trainings, the accumulation of the causes to achieve liberation. So not trainings, but the accumulation of the causes that will lead to the fulfillment of that aspiration of liberation from suffering. And these are, we would have heard in the past, generosity, ethical restraint, patience, and so forth, those 6. So those are the causes that need to be cultivated, but they require the motivation to be developed. So the motivation is the mind striving for liberation. So we first look at what that is, and then how to cultivate it, the method for cultivating it. So in this, now looking at the first of these 2 outlines, identifying the mind striving for liberation. So to understand what the mind is that's striving for liberation, one also needs to understand what liberation is. Otherwise, one's not going to be striving for anything. One needs to understand what liberation is. So the first sentence then explains what liberation is. Liberation is freedom from bondage. In the first sentence here, we see what the meaning of liberation is: freedom from bondage. So then what is bondage? Now the second sentence, karma and afflictions bind one, so binding or bonding. Karma and afflictions bind one in cyclic existence or samsara. So what is it that liberation is freedom from? It's freedom from being bound in cyclic existence by karma and afflictions. So liberation is freedom from the afflictions which lead to the accumulation of contaminated karma. So how we use this word liberation or freedom in society can be very similar to what is meant here. So when a prisoner is released from prison, they are freed from prison, or they are liberated from prison. So we'd say they're freed. They're freed from prison. So this is similar. Being freed from freeing ourselves from the prison of samsara means we are freed from contaminated karma and afflictions. Well, another illustration is if one is in quite a bad car accident, and the emergency services come and they cut one out of the car, then one is freed from the wreck, the car wreck. So similarly, so these two illustrations are similar to when one gains freedom or liberation from cyclic existence. One is freed from the fetters or the binds or the restraints of contaminated karma and the afflictions. One is no longer controlled by them, trapped by them. So liberation is freedom from being bound in cyclic existence, and what is binding us in samsara are the karma and afflictions. The text continues, through the power of these two, karma and afflictions, the aggregates, the physical mental aggregates, are reborn in one of the three realms. So the formless realm, the form realm, or the desire realm, such as the desire realm, as one of the 5 or 6 types of beings, such as gods. So the 5 or 6 types of beings, so this would refer to the 3 lower realms, the human realm, so making 4, and then the god realms, making 5. Or the god realms can be subdivided into 2, that of gods and demigods, suras and asuras. So in this way, 5 or 6 realms. It's just a different way of enumerating the realms. So this is where one is born, and one is born through the power of karma and afflictions. Or the word power can be under the control of karma and afflictions, not under our own control, not with freedom or free will, but under the control or power of karma and afflictions. The text then continues. Let's read this again. Through the power of these two, under the control of karma and afflictions, the physical mental aggregates are reborn in one of the 3 realms, such as the desire realm, is one of the 5 or 6 types of beings, such as gods, and in one of the 4 birthplaces, such as a womb. So one can be born in a womb, one can be born from an egg, one can be born in a spontaneous birth, or due to heat and moisture. So these are the 4 birthplaces, or Tibetan's birthplaces, but maybe birthplaces, ways of birth. The womb, the egg, spontaneous birth, heat and moisture. So these are the 4 ways that one can be born, or 4 places, and this is the meaning of bondage. So what's presented here is that what one is liberation, because this is identifying the mind striving for liberation. So liberation is being liberated or freed from being bound in cyclic existence or in samsara due to contaminated karma and afflictions. So what is it that binds us? Are our contaminated karma and afflictions. And they bind us through controlling our rebirth, or having complete power over our rebirth. As our karma and afflictions are determines which of the 3 realms and in which of the 4 means of birth we take, life after life after life. Never do we have control over it. Our karma and afflictions have control over it. This is the meaning of bondage. One doesn't see it so much anymore, but if you think of, say, a dog tied to a post in the garden, there to be a guard dog, or if you think of in a zoo, a tiger tied or chained to a post, what we see there is these animals, the dog or the tiger, they are restricted. They are bound to this post, and they really have no freedom. No one will look at that dog or that tiger and say, oh, they're enjoying a free life. Clearly, they are bound and have no control over themselves. They cannot go beyond the length of the rope or chain. So here we see 3 components. We have a sentient being, we have a post, and the sentient being then is tied to that or bound to that post. But should what binds them break, or they cut through it, then we'd say they are freed, they are liberated, they can now run wild, they are free again. So this is an analogy to the position we find ourselves in. So we remain, although we take rebirth after rebirth after rebirth, we do this without any control, without any free will. What has control are these fetters or these binds that keep us shackled or trapped in cyclic existence, namely our contaminated karma and our afflictions. It's this that binds us in this wheel of cyclic existence and ensures we remain in this prison of samsara. It ensures that we have no freedom. We do not choose our place or of rebirth or the manner of rebirth. We do not choose the realm. We do not choose whether we are born from a womb or an egg and so forth. Our karma and afflictions have complete power and control over that. But when we break these binds or these ties of karma, karma and afflictions, then we are liberated. We are free. And we are liberated from our karma and afflictions, liberated from cyclic existence, from samsara. Reading the whole of the second last sentence. This is the meaning of bondage. Therefore, freedom from this is liberation. So we see here in the outline, identifying the mind striving for liberation. So what is liberation? It's freedom from bondage. What is the meaning of bondage? It's contaminated karma and afflictions. It is that which binds us. These are the ropes or the chains that bind us in this wheel of cyclic existence, in this process of continued rebirth, this prison of samsara. And then it's freedom from these chains or these shackles, namely karma and afflictions. That is liberation. Liberation from cyclic existence. So I hope now it is very clear what liberation or freedom means and what one is gaining freedom from, which is being tied or bound by or shackled by our karma and afflictions. And of these two, it's really the afflictions that when one eliminates them, one will be freed. It's really the afflictions which in our imagery, in our imagery, we can imagine them as being the chains that bind us in samsara, or the bars on the window of the prison of samsara. It's these afflictions. When they are destroyed, one is liberated from the prison of cyclic existence. One is freed from having to take uncontrolled rebirth in the three realms of samsara. So this then is the meaning of freedom. Freedom from bondage is the meaning of liberation. In the final sentence, the wish to attain this mind, striving for liberation, is what one's striving for. So it's not just to merely understand what is liberation and what is one is being liberated from, but it's to take that further and develop this yearning for freedom. One needs to develop this mind that is striving for liberation. So it's beyond a mere wishing for liberation, but it's a determined attitude, so a striving for liberation. And what is it then that one is striving to be liberated from? So it's a mind that wants freedom from the afflictions, because one has recognized it's these afflictions that bind us within the suffering realms of samsara. So wanting to be freed from suffering is something we all have, but here it needs to be directed towards what is actually binding us, and that is the afflictions. Because as long as one is afflicted, one will remain chained in this prison of suffering. So to generate this yearning and this determined striving attitude for liberation, that requires a method. And that method, you can see it's where we're coming to, that method is to come to recognize the faults of samsara. That's some cyclic existence. Samsara is in the nature of being subject to suffering. As long as one is in this prison, one will suffer. And when reflecting on the faults of samsara, one needs to, in particular, get to recognize the all-pervasive suffering of conditioning. That level of suffering is what we need to gain freedom from. So developing this mind, this determined attitude to gain freedom from the afflictions, to gain freedom from the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, this is the motivation of a practitioner of intermediate capacity. It is, in the analogy I often use, it is the driver behind the car that is driving towards liberation. It is this determination to gain freedom from suffering through, to gain freedom from the afflictions because of having recognized the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality. Developing this yearning for liberation is an absolutely crucial mind. Amongst the several extremely important minds in the Dharma, this is one of them. It is absolutely indispensable for ourselves. So to develop this yearning for liberation, one needs to have come to the point where one wholeheartedly rejects cyclic existence. One does so through understanding that samsara is pervaded by suffering. There is no corner in samsara that one can hope for where one will be freed of pain. This understanding of the pervasive nature of suffering in samsara comes through reflecting on the all-pervasive suffering of conditionality and leads to a rejection of hope for happiness in samsara. So this, you'd know the expression from the Buddha, from his first teaching at Varanasi, suffering needs to be known. And it's referring to suffering at this level. When one recognizes the pervasiveness of suffering in cyclic existence, one will want to know, what is the cause for this suffering? Because if I know what the causes are, then I know what I need to not accumulate, what I need to purify, what I need to abandon. And those causes are the very fetters or the binds, what binds us in samsara, karma and afflictions, particularly the afflictions. It's these that need to be abandoned. It's karma and afflictions which are the origin of our suffering. Our suffering needs to be known. And in particular there, all-pervasive suffering or conditionality needs to be known. And the origin of our suffering, karma and afflictions, needs to be abandoned. So from how I'm expressing this, you will be hearing two different ways combined in one of how to talk about this. The one that I've been referring to is true sufferings and true origins, where one comes to know true sufferings, and thereby, when one knows or recognizes for oneself true sufferings, one seeks out the origin of sufferings, and thereby strives to abandon those causes. Now, that's the way that I've alluded to, and it's the way that will be presented soon. But the way that's been presented thus far is that one needs to recognize our situation in samsara, that as long as we are within samsara, we are subject to suffering. It may be manifest, it may not be manifest in any moment, but it is in the very nature of our samsaric existence that we are subject to suffering. And that suffering has its causes. Those causes are what bind us within samsara, and that is our contaminated karma and our afflictions. So that is the way that's presented here in this verse, and there's a different way of expressing it, which we'll come to, which is through the Four Noble Truths. So hopefully now it's also clear how what is presented here in this outline, identifying the mind striving for liberation, is also an introduction to the Four Truths for Aryas, the Four Noble Truths. Also, by engaging in the reflections that are to be presented, on the basis of the reflections that you have already done, what you are going to come to, the reflections you will come to, will deepen the reflections on the topics you've reflected on already. For example, or in particular, that of refuge. So we've already looked in some detail at turning to the three jewels for protecting refuge. But here, as one reflects on the trainings shared with the practitioner of intermediate capacity, one's refuge also deepens. Because whilst in our prior training we turn to the three jewels for protecting refuge from falling into the suffering of the lower realms, here we come to recognize that the founder Buddha, the Buddha jewel, the Buddha was the one who taught the actual causes, the actual nature of samsara, that one is subject to suffering. And he taught that this suffering must be known and its origins need to be abandoned. So we then, our faith, our trust in the Buddha deepens, recognizing that he has described perfectly why we continue to suffer. And he also, of course, taught the path to freedom. And this is what we strive to cultivate in terms of cultivating the Dharma jewel within. The Dharma jewel necessarily being the other two noble truths, true paths and true cessations. The true paths that one develops within one's mind, and the cessation of the various levels of cessation, where one eradicates the various degrees of subtlety of afflictions. So here one's faith in both the Buddha jewel and the Dharma jewel, and therefore the companions one has, the Sangha jewel, all deepen. So this is how then the reflections we are starting on will help to deepen the reflections on other topics that you've already engaged in. I want to use this link between that I've shown now, between how one, through one's developing of the understanding of a practitioner of intermediate capacity, how it deepens one's refuge, a training included within those trainings shared with the practitioner of initial capacity. So that's just one illustration. But I want to use this illustration to counteract a common misconception. So we take a Lamrim text and they're divided in a variety of chapters. These chapters are individual topics of training. And this is and it's presented in this way because this is the sequence upon which one trains one's mind. A common mistake, though, is to see these chapters as separate. That one's complete, now move to that one. And what's done before is now in the past, now I'm doing this one. And the mistake that's all too often made is they are seen as separate, as distinct, whereas in reality, they are mutually dependent. One builds upon the other. But the sequence is more circular than linear, in that whilst the initial training is the foundation for the later training, which itself is the foundation for the training beyond that, as one engages in the third and fourth trainings, for example, these serve to deepen the prior trainings. So they are not separate, but they are mutually dependent, building one upon the other, not just in a linear way, but actually in a circular manner. So here, when one comes to understand all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, or to put it in less words, when one comes to know suffering, but in particular it's this level of suffering, then that is the level of suffering one will want freedom from. Not just freedom from suffering in the lower realms, but freedom from being freedom from being bound in cyclic existence. This will then, so that's true sufferings. Then that leads one to, so what is the origin? What is the cause of my suffering? Contaminated common afflictions. It's that I need to eradicate. So here, through this deeper knowledge then, one's refuge gains a more power, more depth rather, so does one's recognition of the preciousness of this life, and therefore the need to make the most of it, and so forth. So these latter meditations build on the former meditations, but they also strengthen those former meditations. One's refuge becomes deeper. One's appreciation for this opportunity deepens. Then a second key point to make. So the first was not to see trainings as separate, but really mutually dependent. Second key point to make is, from this we can hopefully see why it's necessary to have a broad education and a deep education. Because if one just says, I want to know the essence, I don't need to know all the details. The less one knows, the less of these, the fewer links one will see, and one will struggle to gain much depth in one's practice. But as one continues to develop one's education, hearing the same teachings on similar topics or the same topics again and again, as one is growing over time in terms of through one's spiritual training, teachings on those same topic carry greater meaning for you and bring about a deeper understanding. So from both of these points, that the various topics are not separate, but mutually dependent, and that one benefits greatly from a broad and deep education, from this we can recognize that seeing some trainings, these are introductory, these are the preliminaries. Looking, in a sense, deprecating, looking down on them is completely mistaken, but rather recognize that these are both the foundation for what will come later, and what comes later strengthens and deepens that foundation. One of the latter sections in the refuge chapter were the refuge precepts, or the trainings of going for refuge. In other words, the trainings to engage in, to strengthen one's refuge, to live in accordance with protecting refuge. And these were expressed in varying ways, but it comes down to the need to abandon non-virtue and accumulate virtue. Now, and that was then presented in some detail afterwards in the Karma chapter. But now through what has just been presented and will later be presented in more detail, is when it comes to abandoning non-virtue, it's really talking about the afflictions. The afflictions will be expressed through our physical behavior, verbal behavior, and that we know we need to abandon. But we need to get to what's beneath that, beneath the physical and verbal non-virtue, and that's the afflicted motivation. So here, when one's education deepens, one's understanding of the refuge trainings deepens, and one recognizes that in order for the three jewels to, for the protection that the three jewels offer to be actualized or received by oneself, it's our afflictions we need to abandon. And not only do we need to abandon non-virtue, namely the afflictions, but we also need to accumulate virtue. And this we've heard about before with the four trainings of ethics, generosity, patience, and joyous perseverance. Here, we will hear about those again. This is the method by which one accumulates virtue, but one will also add to this concentration and wisdom. So here, concentration and wisdom together with the other four trainings of generosity, ethics, patience, and joyous perseverance. These are the cultivation of what will become true paths. So when Buddha Shakyamuni taught the Four Noble Truths, or a better translation is the Four Truths for Aryas, because noble is the word for Arya beings. So the Four Truths for Aryas, he said that suffering needs to be known. Origins need to be abandoned, cessations need to be actualized, and true paths need to be cultivated. So here we've spoken about that suffering needs to be known, its origins, karma and afflictions, need to be abandoned, and the way to get there is to cultivate true paths, namely generosity, ethical restraint, patience, joyous perseverance, concentration, and wisdom. So here we are now talking about 6 practices. Before it was 4. And later, these same 6 practices will be suitable to be called perfections. This presentation that we are growing into here, the trainings being shared with the being of intermediate capacity, is not something unique to the Lamrim. The sequence is clearly presented in the Lamrim, but this is the presentation of the teachings of the Buddha. So when one comes across teachings in another text, such as what we've been covering on Wednesday night, Shantideva's engaging in the Bodhisattva's way of life. There, Shantideva, with different words, has been presenting something very similar. He spoke previously about the need to abandon the afflictions and the need to accumulate virtue. So therefore, we've had a presentation on purification. We've had a presentation on generosity. We're coming towards the end of the presentation on ethical restraint, and soon we'll come to the presentation on patience. So in this way, we see that in other texts, such as Shantideva's, the topics are the same. The sequence and the presentation, this will vary, but the way of actually training is as is presented here. And when it comes to the practices of secret mantra, what they come down to is a different method for achieving the same result: the eradication of the afflictions and the strengthening of virtuous minds through the 6 perfections. So secret mantra differs from sutra in terms of the presentation and the words, but what it comes down to is the same thing. One's cultivating the 6 perfections in order to abandon the afflictions. The one area where secret mantra does differ is in terms of the quality, the power and the power of the mind that is developed by means of secret mantra and used to realize emptiness. The emptiness that is realized is the same, but the realizing mind is far, far more powerful. But that mind that is being developed through the practices of secret mantra is engaging in the practices of generosity, ethical restraint, patience, joyous perseverance, concentration, and wisdom. Those same 6 perfections. And doing so with the same motivation, through cultivating virtuous minds, abandoning non-virtuous minds, with the afflictions, in order to become a Buddha for the sake of others. This is like if one wants to go to Sydney, one can go there by varying means. One can fly, one can go by car or motorbike or by train, but there are different means to arrive at the same destination. So for the destination for a practitioner of great capacity, their destination is Buddhahood. And to become a Buddha, to attain Buddhahood, the afflictions need to be abandoned through the strengthening of virtuous minds. And this can be done by means of training in sutra or training in tantra, which is based on sutra. And another point to make here is that Lama Tsongkhapa encouraged people to engage in the 3: hearing, reflecting, and meditating. So hearing or studying is indispensable because one needs to gather knowledge to understand our situation and what we can do about it. The deeper our education, the deeper our understanding will be. We will also have, by having more knowledge integrated with it, by having more knowledge, there is more to integrate through the process of reflection. And this is what all of you are engaged in, hearing teachings and then reflecting on the teachings. So reflection in this context will mean analytical meditation. So it's what we do in our rooms. And by understanding, the deeper we understand the Dharma, the more we have to integrate. If one just wants to hear the pith instructions, the essence of the teachings, one has very little to integrate within. But as one comes to gather a deeper knowledge, one will not engage in discussions about whether the Lamrim approach or that of the Shantideva's approach is better. One will recognize there's some difference in terms of sequence and emphasis, but other than that, there really isn't much in terms of difference. And through one's deeper education, one's qualities that one is developing deepen. I gave the illustration of refuge. The refuge of a practitioner of initial capacity is turning for protection to the 3 jewels, knowing that in that way they will gain protection from falling to the lower realms. Here, one turns to the 3 jewels, knowing one gains protection from the sufferings of cyclic existence. So in other words, in the being of initial capacity, turn to the 3 jewels, knowing their guidance would lead to their temporary liberation from falling into the lower realms in their next life. Here, one turns to the 3 jewels, knowing that through their guidance, one will achieve complete liberation from suffering in its entirety. And there is a further depth to refuge as well, which comes with the practitioner of great scope. So as one develops one's education, all the qualities one is developing deepen and deepen and deepen. And when one is then ready to engage in the practices of Tantra, one will see, again, the presentation is quite different, but it comes down to developing the 6 perfections in order to abandon the afflictions. That's what it comes down to. So, to be able to do so, Lama Tsongkhapa strongly encouraged that we engage in this process of hearing and reflecting as the preliminary to meditation. So this term meditation in the context of hearing, reflecting, and meditating, it doesn't mean what we colloquially use meditation for. It means single-pointed concentration, or it means meditating with the union of calm, abiding, and meditative insight. So it really is the more yogic levels of meditation. Whereas reflecting is the kind of meditation that we do in our rooms. So these two, hearing and reflecting, are the preliminary to eventually be able to engage in a yogic meditation. When one studying the great texts, when one comes to study the ornament of clear realizations, one is studying there the 6 perfections. So it works a bit better in Tibetan, but so the name of the primary text that is studied is Ornament of Clear Realizations within the topic, but the topic is that of the perfections. So when I say studying the Ornament of Clear Realizations, it refers to a text, but the topic of the text is the perfections. So what one studies there are the 6 perfections in an expansive and detailed manner. It's studied for many years. Then when one comes to the next topic, the next great text, that is the presentation on the middle way, where one looks at the 6th perfection, that of the wisdom realizing emptiness, in particular depth. So in this way, over a number of years, one studies the 6 perfections in great detail, starting with the Ornament of Clear Realizations. So the topic here in Tibetan is called Pachin, and Pachin is the word for perfection. So you would say 6 perfections is the word for Pachin, and then the word for 6. So you study first for many years the perfections in great detail, but all six of them with detail and breadth. Then one comes to the middle way teachings, and there one is studying emptiness in particular, the 6th perfection, in great detail.
Then paramita separate the Uma Selegare Matia Magasrua, Tezadi Donalo
So many years are spent on the paramitas, so the Pachin or the ornament of clear realization, so in these perfections, then followed by detailed on the middle way, the 6th perfection.
Yeah, and in it. So then
we can conclude here for this morning, having looked at identifying the mind striving for liberation, and then we can continue from there this afternoon. If you have any questions, there's still a few minutes. Venerable Lama.
On one level, we need to be healthy and happy enough to do our practice, but on another way, to experience suffering deeply in order to have that revulsion for the psychic existence. How do we balance the two? Because somehow to get to that depth of revulsion is very difficult. We really want to be happy and really level balance and happiness that we need. That's the question. Because I felt like when in Buddha's life he went through those austere practices to get to that real deep level of acknowledgement of suffering. So just do we wish on one level to have that experience of that deep suffering?
So can I say something about the balance that is required? On one hand, we need to be happy and healthy, but we also need to have a revulsion for samsara. And so can Geshe say about how to have a balance between these two, between a revulsion for samsara, but also generally living happily and healthily? So the way Buddha Shakyamuni lived his life, the example that he gave was that neither extreme, the extreme of the greatest existence that one can imagine in our world, nor that of extreme austerities, neither of these are the path to happiness. It is somewhere in between. So that was the reason for living the life he did, for showing that example. And to live this life in between requires the mind to understand our situation and that our situation can be changed. This leads to the mind being very positive. So when you look at the term, the mind striving for liberation, this is the mind that a practitioner will have. Why they're striving for liberation? They've given up on any hope for happiness in samsara, but they recognize something else is possible. So it is a very, very positive mind. It's a mind that knows something worthwhile can be achieved, and they are striving to do so. So it is a very positive mind. That is the mind that will be come to through looking at the fault of where we are and recognizing we can gain freedom from that. So it is a positive mind, not a negative mind. And then just to say, as an addition from the translator side, it's a problem with this word renunciation, because the renunciation in our common usage is always negative. You renounce pleasure, and that is not the meaning. We're renouncing suffering. So therefore, the mind that one is developing is this positive mind striving for liberation.
And
this will keep coming up. So the way to develop this positive outlook, we'll be looking at anyway from this afternoon and throughout this topic.